The ceremonial dagger plunged deep between Lord Nathaniel's shoulder blades as he knelt before the golden throne, crimson spreading across his white ceremonial robes like spilled palm wine on sacred cloth. The great hall of the Akan palace fell silent except for the echo of steel meeting flesh and the soft thud of a body hitting the polished stone floor. What would you do if your closest friend betrayed you in the king's court? Hit like if you've ever felt betrayed, and comment where you're watching from. Prince Oba stood frozen, the bloody blade trembling in his grip, his eyes wide with the horror of what he had just done. Around him, the assembled nobles gasped and stepped back, their colorful Kent robes rustling like autumn leaves in a sudden wind. The ivory throne carved with elephant tusks and leopard heads loomed empty above them all, its golden cushions seeming to mock the chaos below. "Seize him!" commanded Queen Mother Miriam, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a war drum. Her elaborate head wrap of indigo and gold trembled with fury as she pointed a jeweled finger at the prince. "Seize the murderer!" But the royal guards hesitated. This was Prince Oba, son of the late King Daniel, heir to the throne of the mighty Akan kingdom that stretched from the great river to the mountain passes. The same prince who had grown up alongside Lord Nathaniel, sharing meals, training with wooden swords, dreaming of the day they would rule side by side. Lord Nathaniel's wife, Lady Esther, rushed forward with a cry that pierced every heart in the hall. Her elaborate coral necklaces jangled as she fell to her knees beside her husband's still form, her hands hovering over the spreading blood, afraid to touch what could not be undone. "You promised me," she whispered, looking up at Prince Oba with tears streaming down her dark cheeks. "You promised you would protect him. You promised." The weight of her words seemed to break whatever spell had held the prince motionless. He dropped the dagger with a clatter that rang out like a death knell. The blade skittered across the stone floor, leaving a trail of red in its wake. "I had no choice," Prince Oba said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The kingdom, the throne, he was going to—" "Silence!" Queen Mother Miriam's voice boomed across the hall. She descended the steps from the throne platform like a lioness stalking prey, her gold anklets chiming with each step. Behind her, the great tapestries depicting the victories of past kings seemed to watch in judgment. "You have committed murder in the sacred hall of our ancestors. You have violated every oath of brotherhood, every bond of trust." The assembled nobles began to murmur among themselves, their voices rising like the buzz of angry bees. Some called for justice, others whispered of civil war. The kingdom of Akan had not seen such chaos since the time of the Leopard Wars, when brother had fought brother for the right to rule. Prince Oba looked around the hall, seeking a friendly face among the crowd of courtiers and nobles. But where once he had seen allies and supporters, now he saw only fear and condemnation. Even his own personal guard, the men who had sworn to protect him with their lives, stood uncertain and ashamed. "Take him to the pit of sorrows," Queen Mother Miriam commanded, her voice heavy with the authority of generations of royal women who had guided this kingdom through war and peace. "Let him contemplate his crime while the council decides his fate." As the guards finally moved to obey, their bronze spears gleaming in the torchlight, Prince Oba's eyes fell on the empty throne one last time. The seat he had dreamed of occupying, the crown he had imagined wearing, the kingdom he had hoped to rule justly and well. All of it slipping away like water through cupped hands. "The throne will remain empty," declared Elder Samuel, the oldest member of the royal council, his white beard trembling with emotion. "Until this matter is resolved, until justice is served, no one shall sit in the seat of our fathers." The great drums of the palace began to beat slowly, sending word across the kingdom that something terrible had happened in the heart of their realm. From the markets to the farming villages, from the warrior barracks to the sacred groves, the people would soon learn that their prince had fallen from grace in the most shocking way possible. As Prince Oba was led away in chains that had not been used since the rebellion of the Seven Lords, he caught sight of Lord Nathaniel's young son peeking out from behind a pillar. The boy's eyes were wide with confusion and terror, not yet understanding that his father would never come home again, never teach him to hunt, or tell him stories of the old kings. The empty throne seemed to leer down at the blood-stained floor, promising that this was only the beginning of the chaos to come. For in a kingdom built on loyalty and honor, what happens when the heir himself becomes the betrayer? 3 days passed in the pit of sorrows, and Prince Oba had neither eaten nor spoken a word. The underground chamber beneath the palace was carved from living rock, its walls weeping with moisture that caught the light of a single torch like tears on a mourner's face. Here, generations of criminals and traitors had contemplated their crimes before facing the judgment of the throne. Above ground, the kingdom of Akan trembled like a struck drum. In the great market square, women whispered over baskets of yams and plantains, their voices carrying rumors that grew wilder with each telling. Some said the prince had been possessed by evil spirits. Others claimed he had discovered a terrible secret that had driven him to madness. Lady Esther sat in her chambers, surrounded by the wives of other nobles who had come to offer comfort but found only silence. The mirrors of polished bronze reflected a woman aged by grief, her usually elaborate braids now loose and uncombed, her rich robes replaced by the simple white cloth of mourning. "Tell me what happened," she whispered to the evening air, as if her husband's spirit might answer from the realm of the ancestors. "Tell me why our dearest friend would do such a thing." In the royal council chamber, Queen Mother Miriam paced before the empty throne like a caged leopard. The council of elders sat in their carved wooden chairs, their faces grave beneath elaborate caps of leopard skin and eagle feathers. Each man carried the wisdom of decades, the weight of decisions that had shaped the kingdom, but none had faced a crisis like this. "The law is clear," said Elder Samuel, his gnarled fingers tracing patterns on the ancient table of ironwood. "Murder in the sacred hall demands death. Even for a prince." "But he is the only heir," protested Elder Joshua, a younger man whose loyalty to the royal family ran deep as river roots. "If we execute Prince Oba, who will rule? The throne cannot remain empty forever." Queen Mother Miriam stopped her pacing and turned to face the assembled men. In the torchlight, her face showed every line earned through years of guiding kings and princes, of making impossible decisions in impossible times. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "that is exactly what the kingdom needs to consider. What if the throne remains empty until we understand what drove our prince to such darkness? What if this tragedy is not the end, but the beginning of wisdom?" The elders exchanged glances heavy with meaning. For generations, the Akan dynasty had ruled with strength and honor. Kings had died in battle, been claimed by illness, even fallen to palace intrigue, but never had an heir committed murder in the sacred hall itself. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters beneath the palace, whispers carried a different kind of truth. Kukabina, who had served the royal family for 30 years, huddled with the other palace staff around a small fire of cooking coals. "I heard them arguing 3 nights before," she said, her voice barely above the crackle of flames. "The prince and Lord Nathaniel, shouting in the prince's chambers until nearly dawn. Something about letters, about promises that could not be kept." "What kind of promises?" asked Kwame, the stable master, his scarred hands working nervously with a piece of rope. "The kind that topple kingdoms," Kukabina replied, glancing toward the stairs that led to the palace above. "The kind that make friends into enemies and brothers into strangers." In the pit of sorrows, Prince Oba finally stirred from his brooding silence. The torch had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the weeping walls. He rose slowly, his joints stiff from days of sitting on the cold stone floor, and approached the small barred window that looked out onto a courtyard garden. Through the iron bars, he could see the fig tree where he and Nathaniel had carved their initials as boys, swearing eternal friendship beneath its spreading branches. The sight of it brought no comfort now, only the bitter taste of memories turned to poison. "I know you're listening," he said to the guard posted outside his cell. "Tell the Queen Mother I'm ready to speak. Tell her I'm ready to explain why I had no choice but to save the kingdom from the friend I loved like a brother." The guard's footsteps echoed up the stone stairs, carrying word that would shake the palace to its foundations. For Prince Oba was ready to reveal the secret that had turned love into betrayal, friendship into murder, and a kingdom's future into uncertainty. In the sacred hall where Lord Nathaniel's blood still stained the stones despite repeated scrubbings, the empty throne seemed to pulse with anticipation. The ancestors carved into its arms and back appeared to lean forward, waiting to hear truths that would determine not just the fate of a prince, but the destiny of an entire realm. The great drums of the palace began to beat again, but this time with a different rhythm. Not the slow, mournful cadence of tragedy, but the urgent pulse of revelation approaching like a storm across the savannah. Queen Mother Miriam descended into the pit of sorrows as the last light of day painted the palace walls gold and crimson. Her elaborate robes whispered against the stone steps, and the sound of her gold bracelets chiming seemed unnaturally loud in the underground silence. Behind her walked Elder Samuel and 2 royal guards, their faces set like masks carved from dark wood. Prince Oba stood when she entered, but made no move to bow or show the respect traditionally given to the Queen Mother. His eyes, once bright with the promise of kingship, now held the hollow look of a man who had lost everything worth having. "So," Queen Mother Miriam said, settling herself on the simple wooden stool that had been brought for her comfort. "You claim you had no choice. You claim you saved the kingdom by murdering your dearest friend in the sacred hall of our ancestors. Speak then, and let the truth judge whether you are a hero or a monster." Prince Oba moved to the small window, his hands gripping the iron bars until his knuckles showed pale against his dark skin. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of secrets too heavy for any man to bear alone. 3 months ago, Lord Nathaniel came to me with documents," he began, his words falling into the chamber like stones into deep water. "Letters bearing the seal of King Adebayo of the Yoruba lands, our greatest enemy. Letters that promised him vast wealth and lordship over our southern provinces if he would help deliver our kingdom into foreign hands." The silence that followed was so complete that the drip of moisture from the walls sounded like thunder. Elder Samuel's face went gray as old ash, and even Queen Mother Miriam's composed mask cracked slightly. "You lie," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. Prince Oba turned from the window, and in his eyes burned the fire of truth mixed with the ash of betrayal. "I wish I did. I wish these were the ravings of a madman rather than the confessions of a prince who discovered his closest friend was prepared to sell their birthright for gold and power." He reached into the folds of his torn robes and withdrew a folded piece of parchment, its edges worn from handling. "This is one of the letters. Hidden in Lord Nathaniel's private chambers behind the false wall where we used to hide sweets as children. The same wall where he taught me to keep secrets from the adults." Queen Mother Miriam took the letter with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the neat script that bore the unmistakable flourishes of royal correspondence. Elder Samuel leaned close to read over her shoulder, his breathing growing rapid and shallow as the words revealed their poison. "The harvest moon ceremony," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "When the palace guards are reduced for the festival celebrations, when the granaries are full and the people gather in the great square, the gates will be opened at midnight, and your warriors may enter unopened. Nathaniel was to signal the attack by lighting the sacred fire early." Prince Oba continued, his voice growing stronger as the truth finally spilled forth. "The same fire that has burned for 300 years to honor our ancestors. The same fire his own grandfather helped kindle when he served as high priest." Elder Samuel sank onto another stool brought by the guards, his face showing every one of his 70 years. "The harvest moon ceremony is in 5 days. 5 days, and we would have all been slaughtered in our beds, our kingdom carved up like meat at a feast." "But why?" Queen Mother Miriam demanded, rising from her seat as if the words themselves had struck her. "Why would Lord Nathaniel betray everything his family stood for? His ancestors died defending this kingdom. His father saved your father's life in the battle of the river crossing." Prince Oba's laugh held no humor, only the bitter sound of innocence destroyed. "Because King Adebayo promised him something worth more than honor, worth more than friendship, worth more than the blood of his ancestors. He promised him the throne of Akand itself, with a crown of gold and a palace full of conquered enemies' tribute." The truth struck the chamber like lightning illuminating a dark sky. Lord Nathaniel, the king's most trusted adviser, the prince's closest friend, the man whose counsel was sought on every matter of state, had been planning the destruction of everything they held sacred. "I confronted him the night before the ceremony in the sacred hall," Prince Oba said, his voice growing quiet again. "I begged him to reconsider, to remember our friendship, to think of his wife and child. But he laughed at me. He said I was weak, that I would never be the king this realm needed. He said when the Yoruba warriors came, he would personally hand them my head as proof of his loyalty. Queen Mother Miriam felt the letter crumple in her grip as her hands formed fists. The careful political calculations that had guided her for decades crumbled before the reality of such profound betrayal. "So you killed him?" she said, not a question but a statement of fact. "I saved the kingdom," Prince Oba replied, meeting her eyes without flinching. "I chose the life of every man, woman, and child in Achen over the life of the friend who would have sold them all into slavery or death." The underground chamber fell silent except for the steady drip of water and the distant sound of evening drums calling the faithful to prayer. Above them, the empty throne waited for resolution, for justice, for a decision that would echo through generations. But now the Queen Mother faced an impossible choice: execute the prince for murder, or pardon him for treason prevention. Either decision would tear the kingdom apart just as surely as Lord Nathaniel's betrayal would have. Lady Esther stood in the doorway of her husband's study, her eyes red from weeping but her spine straight with the dignity of noble blood. She had come seeking answers among Lord Nathaniel's papers and belongings, hoping to find some explanation that would make sense of the horror that had torn her world apart. What she found instead made her legs weak and her heart sick with a new kind of betrayal. The hidden compartment behind the carved elephant mask had contained more than treasonous letters. Gold coins bearing foreign marks spilled across the wooden desk like drops of liquid sunlight. Maps of the kingdom with military positions marked in red ink. Lists of names, loyal nobles who were to be eliminated when the invasion came. Her own name was among them. "My lady?" Her personal servant, a young woman named Grace, appeared at her shoulder with a worried expression. "The Queen Mother has called for you. She wishes to speak with you about the prince's confession." Lady Esther's hands shook as she gathered the evidence of her husband's treachery, each document feeling heavy as a stone in her palms. The man she had shared a bed with, borne a child for, trusted with her very life, had planned her murder along with the destruction of everything she held dear. In the throne room, Queen Mother Miriam sat not on the golden seat of power but on a simple wooden chair placed before it. The empty throne loomed behind her like a sleeping giant, its presence a constant reminder of the crisis that gripped the kingdom. Around her, the council of elders waited with faces grave as carved masks. When Lady Esther entered, the assembled nobles fell silent. Her entrance was like watching a ghost walk among the living, the wife of the traitor, the widow of the betrayer, the woman whose love had been built on lies as fragile as morning mist. "My lady," Queen Mother Miriam said gently, rising to embrace the younger woman, "I am so sorry for all that you have endured. The loss of a husband is terrible enough without learning such dark truths about his heart." Lady Esther pulled away from the embrace, her eyes bright with unshed tears but her voice steady as river stones. "I found more evidence in his chambers, Your Majesty. Much more." She placed the documents and gold coins on the great table where the elders sat. The foreign gold caught the torchlight and threw it back in harsh gleams that seemed to mock the carved symbols of Achen royalty surrounding them. "He kept detailed records," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Names of those to be killed. Plans for after the invasion. Maps showing how our kingdom would be divided among King Adebayo's generals." Elder Samuel picked up one of the maps with trembling fingers, his eyes tracing the red lines that carved his homeland into foreign territories. "These plans are months old. This betrayal has been growing like a poison tree for half a year or more." "There's something else," Lady Esther said, drawing a letter from the folds of her mourning robes. "A letter addressed to me, to be delivered after the invasion succeeded. He wrote to explain why he had to have me killed along with the rest of you." The silence in the room was so complete that the flutter of torch flames sounded loud as bird wings. Queen Mother Miriam took the letter with hands that had grown old ruling a kingdom, hands that had held babies and signed death warrants, hands that now trembled with the weight of impossible decisions. "He says he loved me," Lady Esther continued, her voice breaking for the first time. "He says killing me would be the hardest thing he ever did, but that King Adebayo demanded the death of all who might challenge the new order. He wrote that he hoped I would understand in the afterlife, when the pain was over. Elder Joshua, the youngest of the council, struck his fist on the table so hard that the gold coins jumped and scattered. What manner of love plans murder? What manner of friend plans betrayal? This man was not simply a traitor, he was touched by evil spirits. No, Queen Mother Miriam said quietly, folding the letter with careful precision. Evil spirits would be easier to understand, easier to forgive. This was a man who made choices, day after day, step by step, until he walked so far into darkness, he could no longer see the light. She rose and walked to the empty throne, placing her hand on one of the carved leopard heads that formed its arms. The wood was warm from the torchlight, smooth from generations of royal hands that had gripped it in times of triumph and crisis. Prince Oba saved more than the kingdom, she said, turning to face the assembled nobles. He saved every person in this room, every child playing in our courtyards, every farmer working our fields. The question now is not whether he was right to kill Lord Nathaniel. The question is whether we have the wisdom to see that sometimes the most terrible acts can be the most necessary ones. Lady Esther stepped forward, her mourning robes rustling like autumn leaves. In her hands she held the ceremonial dagger that had belonged to her husband's family for 5 generations, the same type of weapon that Prince Oba had used to end the traitor's life. I request an audience with Prince Oba, she said, her voice clear and strong. As the wife of the man he killed, I claim the right to face him directly, to hear his words, to judge for myself whether justice was served or murder was committed. The request sent a ripple through the assembled nobles like a stone thrown into still water. Such a meeting was unprecedented, dangerous, potentially explosive. The widow facing her husband's killer in the depths of the palace prison could spark riots, could divide the kingdom further, could end in more bloodshed. But it could also bring the truth into the light where all could see it clearly. Queen Mother Miriam looked at Lady Esther for a long moment, seeing in her face the strength that had made her worthy of noble marriage, the intelligence that had made her husband's betrayal possible, and the courage that would make her judgment trusted by all. Tomorrow at dawn, she said finally, you will meet with Prince Oba in the Chamber of Justice, with the full council as witnesses. Let truth meet truth, and let wisdom guide us all toward whatever justice this terrible situation demands. As the assembled nobles began to disperse, their whispered conversations filling the throne room like the buzz of disturbed bees, the empty throne seemed to watch over them all with carved eyes that had seen the rise and fall of kings, the triumph and tragedy of dynasties, the eternal dance of power and justice that defined the fate of kingdoms. Dawn broke over the palace like spilled blood across golden silk, painting the stone walls in shades of crimson and amber. In the Chamber of Justice, a room carved from living rock beneath the throne hall, candles flickered against walls decorated with ancient symbols of truth and judgment. The air was thick with incense and the weight of impending revelation. Prince Oba sat in chains on a simple wooden stool, his once fine robes now stained with the dirt and despair of his imprisonment. Across from him, Lady Esther took her place on a chair carved with the symbols of her husband's family, the elephant and the river, strength and life flowing together. Between them stood Queen Mother Miriam and the full council of elders, their faces grave as carved masks in the candlelight. The chamber had not been used for such a purpose in living memory, and the ancient stones seemed to pulse with the gravity of what was about to unfold. Let truth be spoken here, Queen Mother Miriam intoned, using the ritual words that had opened proceedings in this chamber for 500 years. Let wisdom guide our hearts and justice guide our hands. Lady Esther leaned forward, her eyes studying the face of the man who had been like a brother to her husband, who had taught her son to ride horses, who had stood as witness at her wedding ceremony. Now she searched that familiar face for signs of the monster, or the hero hidden beneath. Tell me about the last day, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. Tell me about the moment you decided my husband had to die. Prince Oba raised his head, meeting her gaze directly. In the candlelight, his eyes held depths of pain that made Lady Esther catch her breath. This was not the face of a cold-blooded killer, but of a man whose soul had been torn apart by impossible choices. "I didn't decide," he said quietly. "The decision was made for me when I discovered what he planned to do to you, to your son, to everyone we both loved. I became the blade that fate needed to protect the innocent." "Fate?" Lady Esther's voice rose slightly. "You speak of fate as if you had no choice in the matter. As if the gods themselves guided your hand." "Perhaps they did," Prince Oba replied, and for the first time since his imprisonment, something like peace flickered across his features. "Nathaniel was my closest friend, closer than a brother. Do you think I could have killed him for any reason less than the survival of everything sacred?" Elder Samuel stepped forward, his white beard catching the candlelight like silver threads. "Tell Lady Esther about the night you confronted him. Tell her what words passed between friends before friendship died." Prince Oba closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory mixed with anguish. "I found him in the sacred hall, standing before the empty throne. It was near midnight, and he was burning papers in the ceremonial brazier, destroying evidence of his treachery. When he saw me, he laughed." The silence in the chamber was so complete that the drip of wax from the candles sounded like heartbeats counting down to judgment. "He said he had been waiting for me to discover his plans," Prince Oba continued. "He wanted me to know what was coming, wanted me to understand that I was too weak to stop it. He showed me the list of those to be executed. Your name was circled in red ink, Lady Esther, with a note about making your death look like an accident during the chaos." Lady Esther's hand flew to her throat as if she could already feel the assassin's blade. The betrayal cut deeper than her husband's treason. He had planned her murder with the cold calculation of a hunter planning a kill. "He said you had become too influential among the noble ladies," Prince Oba went on, his words falling like stones into deep water. "That King Adebayo feared you might rally the women against the occupation, that your death was necessary to break the spirit of resistance." "And what did you say to him?" she whispered. "I begged him to reconsider. I offered him anything: gold, land, safe passage to distant kingdoms. I reminded him of our childhood together, of the oaths we swore beneath the sacred tree. I spoke of your love for him, of his son's need for a father." Prince Oba's chains clinked as he shifted position, the sound echoing off the stone walls like distant thunder. "But he had already chosen his path. He told me that when the invasion came, he would personally deliver my head to King Adebayo as proof of his loyalty. He said he would make your son watch your execution so the boy would learn to serve the new masters without question." The gasp that escaped Lady Esther's lips was like a physical blow to everyone in the chamber. To know that her husband had planned not just her death but the traumatization of their innocent child was a betrayal beyond forgiveness, beyond understanding. "That was when I knew," Prince Oba said, his voice growing quiet again. "That was when I understood that my friend was already dead, had been dead for months. What stood before me wearing his face was something else entirely, something that had to be stopped before it could destroy everything we held sacred." Queen Mother Miriam stepped forward, her gold jewelry catching the candlelight. "And so you killed him in the sacred hall, before the empty throne of our ancestors." "I executed a traitor," Prince Oba corrected, his voice growing stronger. "I saved a kingdom, protected the innocent, and honored the memory of every king who ever sat on that throne. The only thing I regret is that I could not save Nathaniel from himself." Lady Esther rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate as an elderly priestess approaching the altar. She walked to where Prince Oba sat in chains, stopping so close that she could see her reflection in his eyes. "My husband wrote me a letter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A letter explaining why he had to have me killed. In it, he said he hoped I would forgive him in the afterlife." She paused, her hand moving to the small knife at her belt, not a weapon, but a ceremonial blade used for cutting threads and opening letters. Prince Oba's eyes followed the movement without fear. "I will never forgive him," she said clearly. "But I can forgive you." The words rang through the chamber like the toll of a great bell, settling into the hearts of everyone present with the weight of divine judgment. Lady Esther reached forward and touched Prince Oba's forehead in the traditional gesture of absolution, her fingers gentle as rain on parched earth. You saved my life and my son's life, she said. You chose the hard path of justice over the easy path of denial. You are not a murderer, Prince Oba. You are a protector who paid the highest price for protecting those who could not protect themselves. But even as the words of forgiveness echoed in the chamber, the sound of running footsteps in the corridor above suggested that new troubles were approaching the palace like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The messenger burst into the chamber of justice like a wildfire consuming dry grass, his chest heaving from running and his eyes wide with the terror of terrible news. His traveling clothes were dusty from hard riding, and the ceremonial horn at his side marked him as a royal courier from the border territories. Your Majesty, he gasped, dropping to one knee before Queen Mother Miriam. King Adebayo's army approaches from the south. 10,000 warriors with spears and shields, war drums echoing across the valleys like thunder before the storm. The words hit the assembled nobles like physical blows, and Elder Samuel's face went gray as old ash. In the sudden silence that followed, the chains binding Prince Oba seemed to rattle louder than temple bells. How far? Queen Mother Miriam demanded, her voice cutting through the shock like a blade through silk. 2 days' march, perhaps less, the messenger replied, struggling to catch his breath. They move fast, Your Majesty, carrying light supplies as if they expected to feast on our stores when they arrived. Their advance scouts were spotted near the river crossing at dawn. Prince Oba lurched to his feet despite his chains, the metal links clanking together like angry voices. They're coming because they expected the signal. Nathaniel was supposed to light the sacred fire early to tell them the gates were open and the guards were reduced for the harvest festival. Lady Esther's hand flew to her throat as the full horror of the situation became clear. The festival is tomorrow night. If they attack during the ceremony when half our warriors are celebrating with their families, it will be a slaughter, Elder Joshua finished grimly. Women and children gathered in the great square, guards drunk on palm wine, gates opened wide to let the people flow in and out freely. Queen Mother Miriam began pacing the small chamber like a caged leopard, her mind racing through possibilities and strategies. The kingdom's military strength was considerable, but much of it was scattered across the realm, protecting distant villages and trade routes. Gathering a proper defense in less than 2 days would be nearly impossible. We could send riders to warn the outlying garrisons, suggested Elder Samuel, but even as he spoke, the futility of the idea showed in his voice. If they rode without stopping, they might reach the river garrison by tomorrow evening. Not soon enough, Prince Oba said, his chains rattling as he moved closer to the council. King Adebayo has been planning this invasion for months. He'll have scouts watching all our messenger routes, riders ready to intercept any calls for help. The weight of despair settled over the chamber like a heavy blanket. Everything Lord Nathaniel had planned was still proceeding according to schedule, even though his betrayal had been discovered and his life ended. The invasion would come whether he was there to signal it or not, and the kingdom stood unprepared and divided. There is another way, Prince Oba said quietly, and something in his tone made everyone turn to look at him. A dangerous way, but it might save the kingdom. Queen Mother Miriam stopped her pacing and faced him directly. Speak. Light the sacred fire early, he said, the words falling into the chamber like stones into deep water. Send the signal exactly as Nathaniel planned, but be ready for them. Turn his betrayal into our trap. The silence that followed was so complete that the flickering of candle flames sounded like whispered prayers. The suggestion was audacious, risky beyond measure, and potentially brilliant. You want to invite 10,000 enemy warriors into our kingdom? Elder Joshua asked, his voice tight with disbelief. I want to invite them into a killing ground, Prince Oba replied, his eyes burning with the fire of desperate inspiration. Let them come expecting easy victory and undefended gates. Instead, give them the surprise of their lives. Lady Esther stepped forward, her mourning robes rustling like the wings of a dark bird. The sacred fire has never been lit early in 500 years. It would be seen as the worst kind of blasphemy by our own people. The sacred fire exists to protect the kingdom, Prince Oba countered. Our ancestors would understand that sometimes protection requires breaking sacred traditions. Sometimes the greatest honor comes from bearing the burden of necessary dishonor. Queen Mother Miriam walked to the small window that looked out toward the palace courtyard. Even through the thick walls, she could hear the sound of normal palace life continuing above, servants preparing for the festival, children playing in the gardens, guards changing shifts in the peaceful rhythm of a kingdom at peace. All of that would be shattered if King Adebayo's army found them unprepared. "How would you set this trap?" she asked without turning from the window. Prince Oba's voice grew stronger, more confident, as the plan took shape in his mind. "Gather every available warrior in the kingdom, but keep them hidden in the buildings around the great square. Let the enemy enter through the main gates as planned, but when they're fully committed to the attack, close the gates behind them and strike from all sides." "It's madness," Elder Samuel whispered, but there was something like admiration in his voice. "But it might be the kind of madness that saves kingdoms." The messenger who had brought news of the approaching army cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, there's more. King Adebayo rides with his personal guard at the front of the army. They say he plans to sit on the throne of Akan before the next sunrise. Then he shall have his wish," Queen Mother Miriam said, turning from the window with decision burning in her eyes. "He will indeed sit on our throne, as a prisoner awaiting execution." She moved to stand before Prince Oba, studying his face in the candlelight. Here was the man who had saved the kingdom by killing his best friend, who now offered to save it again by turning blasphemy into strategy. "If we do this," she said slowly, "if we light the sacred fire early and invite our enemies into a trap, you will bear the responsibility for whatever follows. Victory or defeat, salvation or destruction, it will all rest on your shoulders." "I have already borne the weight of my friend's blood," Prince Oba replied. "I can bear the weight of the kingdom's fate as well." Lady Esther stepped forward, and in her hands was the key to Prince Oba's chains. She had taken it from the guard captain's belt without anyone noticing, her fingers moving with the quiet skill of a woman trained in palace intrigue. "If you're going to save the kingdom," she said, fitting the key into the lock, "you'll need to do it as a free man, not as a prisoner in chains." The chains fell away with a crash that echoed through the chamber like breaking bonds of fate itself. Prince Oba rubbed his wrists where the metal had chafed, but his eyes never left Queen Mother Miriam's face. "Give me command of the palace guard," he said. "Let me prove that the man who killed a traitor can also kill the kingdom's enemies. Let me earn the right to sit on the throne I helped save." The request hung in the air like incense smoke, visible and present but impossible to grasp. To give Prince Oba command would be to trust him with the lives of everyone in the kingdom. To refuse might be to lose the only chance they had of surviving the next 2 days. "The Harvest Moon Festival begins at sunset tomorrow," Queen Mother Miriam said finally. "If we're going to turn celebration into warfare, we have less than a day to prepare. Every hour counts, every decision matters." She looked around the chamber at the faces of the elders, the messenger, Lady Esther, and finally Prince Oba. In their expression she saw fear and hope mixed together like oil and water, never quite blending but somehow existing in the same space. "Very well," she said, her words carrying the weight of royal authority earned through decades of wise rule. "Prince Oba, I give you command of our defenses. Elder Samuel, send riders to every garrison within half a day's ride. They must come immediately. Elder Joshua, gather the palace servants and tell them to prepare for siege, not celebration." "And the sacred fire?" Lady Esther asked quietly. Queen Mother Miriam closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 5 centuries of tradition pressing down on her shoulders like a mountain of stone. When she opened them again, her resolve was clear as polished bronze. "I will light it myself at sunset tomorrow," she said. "If our ancestors judge us harshly for breaking tradition to save lives, then I will bear that judgment alone. Some sins are worth committing if they prevent greater tragedies." As the group began to disperse, each person carrying urgent tasks that would determine the fate of the kingdom, Prince Oba caught Lady Esther's arm gently. "Thank you," he said simply, "for forgiving me, for freeing me, for believing that justice sometimes wears the mask of murder." She smiled sadly, touching his cheek with the tenderness of a sister. "My husband chose betrayal and called it wisdom. You chose sacrifice and called it necessity. History will judge which of you was right." But even as plans began to take shape and preparations commenced, none of them noticed the small figure hiding in the shadows near the chamber entrance. A palace servant whose loyalty had been bought with foreign gold, whose ears had heard every word of their desperate strategy. The trap was set, but the hunters had become the hunted without knowing it. The sun climbed slowly toward its zenith, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard where Prince Oba stood watching his hastily assembled warriors prepare for battle. The past 12 hours had transformed the peaceful kingdom of Akand into a fortress bristling with hidden weapons and desperate hope. From her window high in the royal tower, Queen Mother Miriam watched the prince move among the soldiers like a man possessed by righteous purpose. Gone was the broken prisoner who had sat in chains just yesterday. In his place stood a warrior prince whose eyes burned with the fire of a man who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. Below in the great square, the final preparations for the Harvest Moon Festival continued as if nothing had changed. Merchants arranged their stalls with colorful fabrics and carved trinkets, children practiced traditional dances, and women prepared great pots of festival food. But hidden beneath this facade of normalcy, warriors crouched in doorways and behind market stalls, their weapons close at hand. The deception must be perfect, Prince Oba had told his commanders during the dawn briefing. If even one enemy scout suspects a trap, 10,000 warriors will become 20,000 when reinforcements arrive. We get one chance at this, and failure means the end of everything we hold sacred. Captain Marcus, leader of the palace guard, approached with a troubled expression etched deep in his scarred face. He had served the royal family for 20 years, fought in border skirmishes and cattle raids, but never had he faced odds like these. "My prince," he said, keeping his voice low despite the early morning bustle around them. "The men are asking questions. They want to know why we're preparing for war when the enemy isn't supposed to know we discovered the betrayal. They want to know if we can trust a plan that requires us to light the sacred fire early." Prince Oba turned from surveying the square to meet the captain's worried gaze. "Tell them the truth, Captain. Tell them we're outnumbered 10-1, that our only hope lies in turning the enemy's strength against itself, and that sometimes the greatest acts of faith require breaking the rules we hold most sacred. And if they refuse to follow orders that violate tradition, then they can die as traditional corpses when King Adebayo's army overruns the kingdom." Prince Oba replied bluntly. "But I think our warriors love their families more than they fear the judgment of ancestors who lived in times when enemies moved slowly and announced their intentions with formal challenges." As if summoned by their conversation, a group of young warriors approached with hesitant steps. These were men barely old enough to grow full beards, soldiers who had never faced real battle but whose courage burned bright as forged fires. "My prince," their leader said, a tall young man whose spear arm was already legendary among his peers. "We heard about the plan to trap the enemy army in our own festival square. We wanted you to know that we understand what you did in the sacred hall, why you had to kill Lord Nathaniel." Prince Oba studied their faces, seeing in them the future of the kingdom if his desperate gamble succeeded. "And what is it you understand? That sometimes friendship must die so that family can live," the young warrior replied. "That sometimes the hardest choice is the right choice, even when it breaks your heart to make it." The words hit Prince Oba like physical blows, and for a moment his composed mask cracked to show the pain that still lived beneath. These young men saw him as a hero, but he knew the truth, that he was simply a man who had been forced to choose between personal loyalty and greater good, and who would carry the weight of that choice for the rest of his days. "Then you understand why today we must light the sacred fire early," he said. "Why we must commit what looks like blasphemy in order to perform what is actually the highest form of worship, protecting the innocent and preserving the kingdom our ancestors built with their blood and sacrifice." Across the square, Lady Esther emerged from the palace wearing not mourning robes but the elaborate dress of a festival celebrant. Her transformation was so complete that even Prince Oba had to look twice to recognize the grieving widow from the previous day. She approached with purposeful strides, her jewelry catching the sunlight and throwing it back in bright flashes that spoke of wealth and status. But her eyes held depths of determination that no amount of finery could disguise. "I've been thinking about the signal fire," she said without preamble. "About how to make the deception even more convincing." "What do you mean?" Lady Esther glanced around to make sure they would not be overheard, then spoke in the careful tones of a woman who had spent years navigating palace intrigue. "My husband was supposed to light the fire early as a signal to the approaching army. But what if the fire was lit by his widow instead? What if I appeared on the temple platform at sunset, dressed in festival clothes, seemingly celebrating our victory over the prince who murdered my beloved husband?" The audacity of the suggestion took Prince Oba's breath away. For Lady Esther to publicly play the role of a woman celebrating her husband's vindication would require acting skills worthy of the greatest court performers. The enemy scouts watching from the hills would see exactly what they expected to see, she continued. The widow of their ally, triumphant and ready to signal their arrival. They would never suspect that the woman lighting the fire was actually helping to set a trap that would destroy them all. Captain Marcus shook his head in amazement. "My lady, the courage required for such a performance. If the plan fails and you're captured by King Adebayo's forces, they'll realize you helped deceive them. Then I'll die beside the rest of you," Lady Esther replied simply. "My husband planned my death anyway. At least this way, my end will serve some purpose greater than satisfying a traitor's need to cover his tracks." Prince Oba stared at her for a long moment, seeing in her face the same desperate resolve that had driven him to kill his best friend. Here was another person who understood that sometimes survival required the courage to risk everything on a single bold move. "Very well," he said finally. "But you won't die beside us, Lady Esther. When this trap is sprung and King Adebayo's army is destroyed, you'll live to see your son grow up in a free kingdom, to see justice triumph over treachery." But even as the words left his mouth, Prince Oba couldn't shake the feeling that he was making promises the fates might not let him keep. The plan was desperate, dangerous, dependent on perfect timing and extraordinary luck. And somewhere in the approaching enemy army, King Adebayo rode toward what he believed would be an easy conquest, unaware that his careful conspiracy was about to become his destruction. The sacred fire blazed against the darkening sky like a star fallen to earth, its flames reaching toward the heavens as if seeking the approval of ancestors for the blasphemy being committed in their name. Lady Esther stood silhouetted against the orange glow on the temple platform, her arms raised in the traditional gesture of celebration, playing her role as the vindicated widow with an actress's perfect precision. From his hiding place behind the grain storehouse, Prince Oba watched the hills beyond the kingdom walls where enemy scouts would be positioned. Through the gathering dusk, he could see the brief flash of reflected light that meant signal mirrors were being used. King Adebayo's army had seen the early fire and was beginning to move. "They're coming," he whispered to Captain Marcus, who crouched beside him with a bronze sword naked in his hands. "The trap is set, and the prey approaches." Around the great square, hidden warriors shifted nervously in their concealment. Behind market stalls and in doorways, beneath festival platforms and inside storage buildings, nearly 1,000 of Akin's finest soldiers waited with weapons ready and hearts pounding like war drums. The normal festival crowd continued their celebrations, unaware that death approached on swift feet through the darkness. Children danced around smaller fires while their parents shared palm wine and honey cakes, their laughter and music providing perfect cover for the sounds of warriors preparing for battle. "How long?" Captain Marcus asked, his scarred face grim in the firelight. "Not long," Prince Oba replied, checking the position of stars that would tell him the hour. "King Adebayo promised his men they would feast on our stores tonight. He'll want to attack while the celebration is at its height, when guards are drunk and gates are wide open." As if summoned by his words, the first enemy scouts appeared at the kingdom's main entrance, men dressed as traveling merchants, their weapons hidden beneath bundles of trade goods. They moved through the open gates with casual confidence, their eyes mapping the positions of guards and noting the festival crowd that filled the square like sheep ready for slaughter. Prince Oba's hand tightened on his spear as he recognized the lead scout, a man named Kofi who had once served in Akin's own army before selling his loyalty to the highest bidder. The sight of the traitor walking freely through the kingdom he planned to help destroy made Prince Oba's blood burn with rage that threatened to break his careful control. "Steady," Captain Marcus whispered, sensing his prince's tension. "Let them commit fully before we spring the trap." The scouts spread through the crowd like poison in a water source, seemingly absorbed in the festivities while actually counting warriors and assessing defenses. One approached the base of Lady Esther's platform, looking up at her with eyes that glittered with anticipation of coming violence. From her elevated position, Lady Esther saw the scout's face clearly, and recognized him as one of her husband's frequent visitors during the months of planning betrayal. The sight of him made her stomach turn with revulsion, but she maintained her celebratory pose, even raising her voice in a traditional harvest song that echoed across the square. The main gates remained open as festival tradition demanded, welcoming all who wished to share in the kingdom's prosperity. But hidden beneath the platforms and behind the decorative screens, warriors with crossbows waited for the signal that would turn celebration into carnage. Then the sound came that chilled every defender's blood, the low, rhythmic beating of war drums from beyond the walls. King Adebayo's army was no longer approaching in stealth. They were announcing their arrival with the confidence of conquerors who believed they faced no serious resistance. 10,000 warriors, Prince Oba murmured, watching as torches began to appear on the road leading to the kingdom. Against our 1,000. The odds haven't improved. The odds don't matter if we're fighting for everything we hold dear, Captain Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the impossible situation they faced. Your father always said that 10 men defending their homes fight like 100 men seeking glory. The enemy army flowed toward the gates like a dark river of bronze and iron, their spear points glinting in the torchlight, their war cries beginning to rise above the festival music. King Adebayo himself rode at their head on a magnificent black stallion, his armor gleaming with gold inlay that spoke of victories won and kingdoms conquered. In the great square, the festival crowd began to sense that something was wrong. The music faltered as musicians noticed the growing sound of war drums, and parents began gathering their children closer. But before panic could take hold, Prince Oba made his decision. Now! He shouted, his voice carrying across the square like thunder. For Akent! For our children! For justice! The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. Where moments before there had been festival celebrants, now warriors rose from concealment with weapons gleaming. The market stalls revealed themselves as barricades, the decorative platforms became archer positions, and the grain storage buildings disgorged companies of spearmen like anger made manifest. King Adebayo, riding through the gates with his personal guard, suddenly found himself not entering a defenseless kingdom, but riding into the mouth of a carefully prepared trap. His confident smile faltered as he realized that the early sacred fire had not been a signal of victory, but a lure to destruction. Close the gates! Prince Oba commanded, and massive bronze-reinforced doors swung shut with a boom that echoed like doom itself. Let none escape to warn other armies! The enemy warriors, caught between the closed gates behind them and rising defenders on all sides, fought with the desperation of men who suddenly understood they had been outmaneuvered by the very people they had come to conquer. But King Adebayo was no ordinary warlord, and his army was not easily defeated. Even trapped, 10,000 warriors were still 10,000 warriors, and they began to form defensive circles, their shields locked together like turtle shells, their spears bristling outward like deadly thorns. You think you've won, boy prince? King Adebayo shouted across the square, his voice carrying over the clash of bronze on bronze. You've only delayed your defeat. When my allies realize what has happened here, they will come with 20,000 warriors to finish what I began. Prince Oba stepped into the firelight where his enemy could see him clearly, his spear bloody from the first moments of battle, his face grim as carved stone. Your allies will find only your bones and the story of what happens to those who threaten the innocent. But even as he spoke defiantly, Prince Oba knew that King Adebayo might be right. This battle might be won, but the war for the kingdom's survival was just beginning. Blood ran like spilled wine across the stones of the great square as the battle raged through the night with the fury of unleashed storms. Prince Oba fought at the forefront of his warriors, his spear dancing through enemy ranks like lightning seeking earth. But even his skill and courage could not overcome the mathematics of warfare. 10,000 enemies against 1,000 defenders was a calculation that ended in only one way. King Adebayo's warriors, though trapped, fought with the discipline of men who had conquered kingdoms before. Their shields formed impenetrable walls, their spears thrust out in coordinated waves, and slowly but steadily they began to carve territories within the square despite the desperate resistance of the Akan defenders. From the temple platform where the sacred fire still blazed, Lady Esther watched the battle with growing despair. She had played her part perfectly, lighting the fire that drew the enemy into the trap, but now she could see that the trap might not be strong enough to hold what they had caught. "My lady!" A young warrior stumbled up the temple steps, his arm bloody from a spear thrust, his eyes wide with the terror of impending defeat. "Prince Oba says you must flee. There's a hidden passage beneath the temple that leads to the river. Take your son and go!" Lady Esther looked down at the young man whose courage had brought him through the chaos of battle to deliver this message. Behind him, she could see Prince Oba still fighting, still trying to rally his outnumbered forces, still believing that somehow justice would triumph over superior numbers. "I will not run," she said firmly. "I lit the fire that brought them here, and I will see this through to whatever end awaits us all." The young warrior stared at her in amazement, then nodded with the respect due to courage recognized. "Then I return to the battle, my lady. If we must die, let us die with honor intact." As he disappeared back into the chaos, Lady Esther made a decision that would echo through the generations of her kingdom. She took up the ceremonial horn that was used to call the people to festival gatherings, raised it to her lips, and blew a single, piercing note that rose above the clash of weapons and the cries of the wounded. The sound carried beyond the palace walls, beyond the trapped battle in the square, out into the darkness where other ears waited to hear it. For Lady Esther had sent more than one message in the past day, and not all of her preparations had involved the battle within the kingdom's walls. In the great square, Prince Oba heard the horn call and felt his heart lift with hope he had not dared to feel. Around him, his warriors were falling back step by step, their circles of defense growing smaller as enemy spears found their marks. But the horn call meant that help was coming, if they could survive long enough for it to arrive. King Adebayo heard the horn as well, and his experienced warrior's instincts told him that the sound meant reinforcements approaching. But he had scouts posted on all the roads, watchers in the hills who would have warned him of any Akan army large enough to threaten his forces. "One last push!" he commanded his warriors. "Finish them now, before whatever help they've summoned can arrive." The enemy assault intensified like fire fed with fresh oil, and for a moment it seemed that the Akan defenders would be overwhelmed entirely. Prince Oba found himself fighting back-to-back with Captain Marcus, their spears weaving a pattern of desperate defense as enemy warriors pressed closer with each passing moment. "It's been an honor, my prince," Captain Marcus gasped between spear thrusts, his face streaming with blood from a cut above his eye. "The honor has been mine, old friend," Prince Oba replied, then thrust his spear point through an enemy shield to find the man behind it. "But we're not dead yet." Even as he spoke, a new sound joined the chaos of battle, not the war drums of King Adebayo's army, but the deeper, more rhythmic beating of Akan's own ceremonial drums. The sound grew stronger, closer, accompanied by voices raised in the ancient war songs of their people. King Adebayo's confidence faltered as he realized that the horn call had indeed summoned help, but not from where he had expected. The relief force wasn't coming down the roads his scouts watched, but emerging from the very buildings around the square, buildings he had assumed contained only cowering civilians. Lady Esther's second message had gone not to distant garrisons but to the people of the kingdom itself. To farmers who had set aside their planting tools for weapons, to craftsmen who had traded hammers for spears, to women who had left their cooking fires to take up the swords of their ancestors. They poured into the square from every doorway and alley, not trained warriors but ordinary people who had heard that their kingdom faced destruction and chosen to fight rather than submit. They carried hunting spears and woodsmen's axes, blacksmith hammers and kitchen knives, but they carried them with the fury of those who fought for their children's future. "The people!" Prince Oba shouted, his voice carrying across the battle. "The people have come to save their kingdom!" The tide of battle turned as dramatically as a river changing course in flood season. King Adebayo's warriors, who had been pressing their advantage against the trained defenders, suddenly found themselves surrounded by thousands of angry civilians who cared nothing for military tactics and everything for protecting their homes. The enemy formation, so disciplined and effective against formal military opposition, began to crack under the pressure of ordinary people fighting with extraordinary courage. Farmers tackled armored warriors with their bare hands, craftsmen used their trade tools to devastating effect, and women fought alongside men with the fierce protection of lionesses defending their cubs. King Adebayo himself, still mounted on his great black stallion, found his way blocked by an elderly woman carrying nothing but a cooking pot and the kind of righteous anger that had toppled kingdoms before. "You came to steal our children's future," she told him, raising the pot like a weapon. "But you forgot that mothers don't surrender, and grandmothers don't retreat." The sight of their king being confronted by a grandmother with a cooking pot might have been amusing under other circumstances, but King Adebayo's warriors were too busy fighting for their lives to appreciate the irony. Surrounded, outnumbered, and facing an enemy that fought not for conquest but for survival, they began to lay down their weapons in surrender. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky the color of spilled blood, Prince Oba stood victorious in the great square where his desperate gamble had paid off in the most unexpected way. Around him, the people of his kingdom, his people, tended to the wounded and secured the prisoners with the competent efficiency of those who had won their freedom through their own courage. But victory brought its own burdens, and Prince Oba knew that the hardest decisions still lay ahead. The empty throne no longer loomed like a judgment over the great hall. As the first full rays of sunlight streamed through the high windows, painting the carved leopards and elephants in gold and amber, Prince Oba approached the seat of his fathers with steps heavy with the weight of all he had endured and all he had learned. Queen Mother Miriam stood beside the throne, her face showing every line earned through years of guiding the kingdom through crisis and triumph. Around the hall, the assembled nobles and elders waited in silence, their eyes fixed on the man who had saved them all by first destroying everything he had once held dear. "The kingdom stands," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the great hall. "Our enemies are defeated, our people are safe, and the empty throne calls out for a ruler worthy of the crown." Lady Esther stepped forward from her place among the noble families, no longer wearing mourning robes but dressed in the rich blue and gold that signified new beginnings. In her hands she carried the ceremonial crown that had sat untouched since the old king's death, a circle of gold inlaid with ivory and precious stones, each gem representing one of the kingdom's great victories over the centuries. "Prince Oba," she said, her voice clear and strong, "you killed my husband to save the kingdom. You risked your own life to protect people who had condemned you as a murderer. You turned betrayal into victory and proved that sometimes the hardest choices are the right choices." She held out the crown, and in the gesture was forgiveness completed, justice acknowledged, and the future offered to hands that had been stained with necessary blood. But Prince Oba did not immediately reach for the symbol of power he had dreamed of since childhood. Instead, he turned to address the assembled nobles, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I have learned that friendship can become betrayal when ambition poisons the heart," he said, his words echoing off the ancient stones. "I have learned that sometimes protecting the innocent requires becoming what others call a monster. And I have learned that a kingdom's true strength lies not in its warriors or its walls, but in the courage of ordinary people who choose to fight for what they love." King Adebayo, brought in chains to witness the coronation of the man who had defeated him, laughed bitterly from his place among the prisoners. "Pretty words from a prince who murdered his best friend. Do you think a crown will wash the blood from your hands?" Prince Oba turned to face his defeated enemy, and in his eyes was not anger but the deep sadness of understanding. "No crown can wash away what I've done," he said quietly. "The blood of my friend will stain my hands until the day I join the ancestors. But that stain reminds me every day of the cost of justice, of the price of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. He looked around the hall at faces he had known since childhood, nobles who had watched him grow from boy to prince to the man who had saved them all. I will wear that stain as I wear the crown, as a reminder that power exists not for the comfort of those who hold it, but for the service of those who need it. Lady Esther stepped closer, the crown still extended in her hands. Then take it, she said. Take the throne that you earned not through birthright but through sacrifice. Rule the kingdom you saved, and let your reign be remembered not for how it began, but for how it serves the people who put their trust in your stained hands. Prince Oba reached out and took the crown, feeling its weight, not just the physical heaviness of gold and jewels, but the spiritual burden of responsibility for every life in the kingdom. As he placed it on his head, the assembled nobles and common people alike fell to one knee in acknowledgement of their new king. But Queen Mother Miriam remained standing, and when she spoke, her words carried the authority of generations of royal wisdom. King Oba, she said, using his new title for the first time, you have won the crown through courage and sacrifice. Now you must prove worthy of it through the choices you make in the days and years to come. The newly crowned king nodded solemnly, understanding that this coronation was not an ending but a beginning. Outside the palace walls, the kingdom of Akan continued its ancient rhythms, farmers tending crops, craftsmen creating beauty from raw materials, children playing in village squares, mothers singing lullabies to babies who would grow up free because of the terrible choices made in these dark days. The throne will no longer be empty, King Oba declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. But neither will it be a place of comfort or easy decisions. It will be a seat of service, a reminder that those who rule do so only with the consent of those they serve. He turned to face King Adebayo one last time, and his next words would be remembered as long as the kingdom stood. You came here expecting to find weakness and division. Instead, you discovered that a kingdom united in defense of its values is stronger than any army motivated only by greed. Your defeat will serve as a warning to all who would threaten the innocent. Justice may sleep, but it never dies. As the coronation ceremony concluded and the new king took his place on the throne that had waited so long for a worthy occupant, the great drums of the palace began to beat in celebration. The sound carried across the kingdom, from the great cities to the smallest villages, announcing that the time of uncertainty had ended and the time of renewal had begun. King Oba sat on his throne and looked out at his people, those who had fought beside him, those who had forgiven him, those who would depend on his wisdom in the years to come. The weight of the crown pressed down on his head like the hands of all the kings who had come before, but he bore it gladly. For he had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest act of love is betrayal, the greatest act of friendship is murder, and the greatest act of service is accepting the burden of power not for what it gives you, but for what it allows you to give others. The empty throne was empty no more, and the kingdom of Akan had found its king, not in spite of his sins, but because of his willingness to bear them in service of something greater than himself. What do you think of King Oba's journey from betrayer to savior? Share this epic tale with someone who loves stories of redemption and African kingdoms. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more gripping palace tales. Comment below with your thoughts on this incredible story of royal betrayal, loyalty, and the true meaning of justice.